The morning I realized someone from our HOA had crossed a line they never should have crossed, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. I wasn't even drinking it anymore. I was just staring through the window at my backyard, while muddy water rolled across grass I had spent years building with my own hands. The strange part wasn't the flooding itself. We lived outside Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Heavy storms happened. Water happened. What didn't happen was water pouring through a freshly dug trench that hadn't existed the week before. And what really didn't happen was finding out later that the trench wasn't even supposed to be there in the first place. My name is Ethan Mercer, and 6 years ago, my wife Claire and I bought a house in a neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates. It wasn't a fancy development. Nobody was driving Lamborghinis or hosting champagne parties by the pool. It was just a quiet, middle-class neighborhood filled with teachers, nurses, contractors, and families trying to build decent lives. We loved it immediately. The house itself needed work, but that never bothered me. I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys fixing things. Maybe it's because I work as a civil engineer. Maybe it's because my dad raised me believing every problem can be solved if you're willing to get dirty and stay patient long enough. Whatever the reason, I became obsessed with our backyard. For almost 3 years, I worked on it every weekend. I planted trees, built a stone patio, installed drainage improvements, leveled uneven sections of lawn, added landscape lighting. I spent entire Saturdays moving dirt from one side of the yard to the other because something looked half an inch off. Claire thought it was ridiculous. One evening, she stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of wine and found me kneeling in the grass with a measuring level. You know, normal people watch football on weekends, right? I looked up. Normal people don't understand drainage patterns. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped both glasses. That backyard became our favorite place in the world. Summer cookouts, birthday parties, quiet evenings after work. It wasn't just property anymore, it was ours. Now, the HOA had always been a little annoying. Not evil, just annoying. The kind of annoying where you open your mailbox and discover a violation notice because your trash can stay visible 3 extra hours after pickup day, or because your mulch color didn't perfectly match community guidelines, stuff like that. And at the center of almost every complaint sat the HOA president, a woman named Karen Holloway. Karen was one of those people who seemed permanently convinced she was the smartest person in every room. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every sentence sounded like it came from a corporate handbook. She loved phrases like maintaining community standards, protecting property values, ensuring neighborhood excellence, which sounds impressive until you realize she's talking about mailbox decorations. Nobody really liked Karen. Most people just avoided her. Because here's the thing about HOA politics. The people who care the most usually have way more free time than everyone else. The rest of us have jobs, kids, mortgages, lives. Karen had meetings. For years, I mostly stayed out of it. Then everything changed one Thursday afternoon. I'd just gotten home from work when I noticed construction equipment behind the common area near the back of several lots, including ours. Small excavator, utility trailer, a couple workers digging what looked like a shallow channel through a grassy section behind the fence line. At first, I didn't think much about it. Neighborhoods do drainage projects all the time. But something about the grading bothered me immediately. Not enough to start an argument, just enough to make a mental note. The slope looked wrong. Water appeared to be directed toward private property instead of away from it. As an engineer, certain things jump out at you. The same way a mechanic notices strange engine noises, or a doctor notices symptoms everyone else misses. My instincts were quietly telling me something wasn't right. 3 days later, we got our answer. A massive spring storm rolled through just after dinner. Thunder rattled the windows. Rain hammered the roof. The gutters overflowed. Claire and I were cleaning dishes when she suddenly looked out the kitchen window and froze. "Ethan." I turned. "What?" She pointed outside. "Oh my God!" Water was rushing through that trench like a river, not trickling, not draining, rushing. A thick stream of muddy runoff poured directly into our backyard, spreading across the lawn and surrounding the patio. Within minutes, the lower half of the yard looked like a swamp. I remember standing there silently watching it happen. There are moments when you're so angry your brain hasn't figured out how angry yet. That's where I was. Claire glanced at me carefully. "You okay?" I kept staring out the window. "No." Then after a pause, I added something that surprised even me. But whoever approved this is eventually going to regret it. The next morning, I sent an email to the HOA board. Professional. Polite. No accusations. I explained that recent construction appeared to be redirecting storm runoff onto my property. I attached photos, videos, timestamps, everything. Karen replied the following Monday. 4 sentences. 4. According to her, the project had been approved as part of a neighborhood water management initiative and had been completed by qualified contractors for the benefit of all residents. Then she added a sentence that immediately got under my skin. We apologize for any temporary inconvenience. Temporary inconvenience. That's what she called thousands of gallons of muddy water flooding my yard. Like someone parked in the wrong spot for 15 minutes. I responded asking for project plans, drainage calculations, construction documents, anything. Karen sent one final email. The project was completed appropriately and will improve conditions long term. Then she stopped responding completely. No calls, no emails, nothing. Now, most people probably would have exploded at that point. I understand the temptation, believe me. But I've spent nearly 2 decades dealing with contractors, inspectors, developers, and government agencies. And one lesson gets reinforced over and over again. The first person who loses emotional control usually loses strategic control right afterward. So instead of getting louder, I got quieter. And that was the moment Karen Holloway unknowingly created the biggest problem of her entire time as HOA president. Because once I stopped arguing, I started investigating. I documented everything, every storm, every puddle, every inch of standing water, every damaged section of grass, every muddy stain left behind after flooding receded. I photographed it all, recorded videos, saved weather reports, organized folders, created timelines. Claire started joking that our dining room looked like a detective agency. One evening, she walked in and found me surrounded by maps, photographs, and drainage diagrams. She raised an eyebrow. Please tell me you're not building a conspiracy board. I looked up. I'm not. Then I pointed at a stack of documents. I'm building evidence, she laughed. But then she noticed I wasn't laughing back, and that's when she realized I had seen something. Something bigger than flooding, something that wouldn't leave me alone. Because the more I studied that trench, the more one thought kept returning. It looked way too close to the property line, and if my instincts were right, this wasn't just a drainage problem anymore. It was something much worse, something that could bring the entire HOA crashing down. Something that could bring the entire HOA crashing down. The funny thing about instincts is that they're easy to ignore when they whisper, but once they start screaming, you either listen or you regret it later. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that trench. Every time I looked at it, something felt off. Not maybe off, wrong. The distance, the angle, the placement. The whole thing looked like somebody had eyeballed the project instead of measuring it. And when construction projects start relying on guesses, bad things tend to happen. So I made a phone call. A week later, a licensed land surveyor named Walter Grayson showed up at my house. Walter looked exactly how you'd imagine a guy who spent 40 years measuring property lines would look. Sunburned face, old boots, baseball cap faded almost white from years in the sun. The kind of guy who spoke only when he had something worth saying. For nearly 3 hours, he walked the property carrying equipment that probably cost more than my first car. I followed him around like an anxious parent waiting outside a hospital room. Every so often, he'd stop, check coordinates, write notes, move 20 feet, repeat. Finally, he waved me over near the rear section of the yard. He drove a bright orange stake into the ground and looked at me. You said the HOA approved that trench. That's what they told me. Walter stared at the trench, then at the stake, then back at me. Well, he paused. They've got themselves a problem. My stomach tightened. How bad? He pointed toward the trench. That channel sits approximately 6 feet inside your property boundary. I blinked. What? 6 feet? I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain rejected the information for a second. 6 feet wasn't a measurement error. 6 feet wasn't confusion. 6 feet was an entire decision. Walter shook his head. Somebody never checked a survey before they started digging. The drive home from work that afternoon felt completely different. Until that moment, I'd still left room for the possibility that this was simple incompetence. Now we were talking about unauthorized excavation on private property. Everything changed. That evening, Claire sat across from me at the kitchen island while I spread survey documents across the counter. She studied the map, then looked up. They actually dug onto our land? Yep. By 6 feet? Yep. And then redirected water into our yard? Yep. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she leaned back. So what happens now? I remember looking down at the stack of papers, the flood photos, the emails, the survey, the timeline, the evidence, and suddenly something became very clear. Karen had spent months helping me build a case against her without realizing it. Now I just needed her to finish the job. Most people think legal disputes are won through dramatic confrontations. The reality is usually much less exciting. They're won through documentation, patience, and letting the other side keep talking. So instead of confronting Karen with the survey immediately, I decided to try something different. I sent her another email, friendly, casual, almost suspiciously pleasant. I told her I was updating homeowner records for insurance purposes and wanted additional information regarding the drainage project. Specifically, I requested 3 things: the contractor name, the official project title, and the dates construction occurred. That was it. No accusations, no threats, nothing. Karen replied 47 minutes later. I know because I checked. She provided everything. Project name, contractor company, timeline, board authorization references. And then, right at the bottom, she included a sentence so beautiful I almost framed it. We appreciate homeowners taking an active interest in community improvement projects. I stared at that sentence for nearly 30 seconds. Then I started laughing. Claire walked into the room. What? I turned the screen toward her. What? She just handed me the rest of the case. The next morning, I contacted a property attorney named Rebecca Lawson. A colleague from work had used her years earlier during a commercial easement dispute. I scheduled a consultation, brought every document I had: survey reports, photos, videos, emails, flood records, weather data, construction information, everything. Rebecca spent nearly an hour reviewing the material. She barely spoke the entire time, just read, made notes, highlighted sections, turned pages. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. Well, that was all she said. Well, I waited. She looked at me. This is unusually clean. What does that mean? It means they documented most of their liability themselves. I have to tell you, there are few sounds more comforting than hearing a lawyer sound impressed. We spent another hour discussing options, lawsuits, property damage claims, trespassing, injunctions, engineering assessments, the whole package. Part of me wanted to go straight to court, not because of the money, because of the disrespect, because every ignored email replayed in my head, every dismissive response, every time Karen acted like I was an inconvenience. But Rebecca explained something important. People love courtroom victories, she said, but efficient victories are usually better. She was right. So we built something else, a demand package, and honestly, it was a masterpiece. Every HOA board member received their own certified copy, not just Karen. That detail was intentional. Rebecca explained why. The moment individual board members realized they could personally become part of litigation, panic spreads quickly. She wasn't wrong. The package laid everything out point by point: survey evidence proving encroachment, photographs documenting flooding, construction records, email admissions, engineering observations, timeline documentation. Then came our demands: remove the trench completely, restore the property to pre-construction condition, replace damaged landscaping, reimburse survey expenses, pay attorney fees, compensate for drainage damages, install a professionally engineered drainage solution entirely on HOA property, and finally, provide a written acknowledgement of responsibility. 30 days. That was the deadline. 30 days before formal litigation began. The response came in 3, not from Karen, from an attorney. That alone told me everything. His voicemail sounded incredibly polite, almost painfully polite, the kind of politeness people use when they're trying very hard not to sound nervous. Mr. Mercer, I represent Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and would appreciate coordinating with your counsel regarding possible resolution. Possible resolution? I smiled the second I heard it. Because a week earlier they'd been telling me everything was perfectly fine. Now they wanted resolution. Rebecca called their attorney the following morning. Later that afternoon my phone rang. I answered. So? She laughed. Actually laughed. Ethan, they're terrified. Seriously? Oh yeah. What happened? There was a pause. Then she said something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Several board members had no idea Karen approved the excavation without commissioning a property survey first. I sat upright. What? Apparently she pushed the project through herself. I stared out my office window. For the first time, the pieces started fitting together. This wasn't some grand HOA conspiracy. This wasn't a board full of villains plotting against homeowners. This was worse. It was one person becoming so comfortable with authority that she stopped questioning herself. Karen had spent years sending violation notices, approving requests, denying requests, enforcing rules. Eventually, nobody challenged her. And when people stop challenging you, something dangerous happens. You begin assuming you're right before you've checked whether you're right. The more Rebecca learned, the uglier things became. Several board members were furious. Apparently, Karen had presented the project as routine maintenance. Nobody realized property boundaries hadn't been verified. Nobody realized excavation had crossed onto private land. Nobody realized runoff was being redirected toward residential lots. And now, every one of them was staring at potential legal exposure. The attorney requested a meeting. Rebecca advised me not to attend. Why? Because right now, you're the reasonable homeowner with documentation. She smiled. Let's keep it that way. Over the following 2 weeks, negotiations moved quickly. Faster than I expected. Honestly, faster than anyone expected. Every time the HOA attorney pushed back on something, Rebecca would simply send another piece of evidence. Flood photos, survey diagrams, email chains, weather reports, engineering notes. The resistance got weaker every time. Then one Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was leaving work. Rebecca. I answered immediately. What's up? Her voice sounded amused. They accepted everything. I stopped walking. What? Every demand. No negotiations? Nope. No negotiations? Nope. Everything? Nope. Everything. Everything. For a second, I just stood there in the parking lot, surrounded by cars and traffic noise. Months of frustration, months of being ignored, months of watching someone abuse authority because they assumed nobody would challenge them. And suddenly it was over, or at least the first half was, because while the legal battle had ended, the public fallout was only beginning. Because while the legal battle had ended, the public fallout was only beginning. 3 weeks later, the restoration crews arrived, and I have to admit something that probably makes me sound petty. Watching workers undo every mistake the HOA had paid to create was unbelievably satisfying. Monday morning, 3 trucks pulled into the neighborhood before 8 o'clock. They brought grading equipment, drainage materials, replacement trees, fresh sod, and enough tools to completely rebuild half my backyard if necessary. The crew supervisor was a guy named Travis Boone. Big guy, permanent tan, looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors. He walked the property with a clipboard, studied the trench for maybe 10 seconds, then turned toward me. Who designed this? The HOA. He laughed. No, seriously, I am serious. He stared at me. Then he looked back at the trench. Then back at me. You know what? Never mind. I don't think I want to know. That became the unofficial joke of the entire project. Every contractor who looked at the trench reacted the same way. Like they had discovered somebody trying to repair a car engine with a chainsaw. Nobody could understand how anyone approved it, especially without verifying property lines first. The first stage involved removing the trench completely. Truck after truck delivered fresh soil, damaged areas were regraded, flooded sections of lawn were rebuilt. The lower section near the tree line had become saturated enough that portions of the ground needed stabilization before new landscaping could even begin. 2 privacy trees had suffered significant root damage. That part bothered me more than I expected. Those trees represented years, not money, years. I planted them during our first summer in the house. I remembered sweating through 90-degree heat while Claire sat nearby in a folding chair drinking lemonade and making fun of me. You know, trees aren't supposed to line up like soldiers. It looks better. They're plants, they need discipline. She laughed so hard she nearly fell out of the chair. Now those same trees were being removed because somebody with too much authority and not enough caution decided property boundaries were optional. Fortunately, the settlement agreement required replacement with equal or better materials. The new trees were larger, healthier, more mature. Travis seemed genuinely delighted every time he added another expense to the HOA's bill. One afternoon, he grinned while reviewing paperwork. "These are nice trees, they should be." "They're expensive." "Good," he laughed. "I like you." By the middle of the week, the backyard already looked better than it had before the flooding started. Fresh sod covered damaged sections of lawn. Drainage grades had been corrected. Standing water issues disappeared. Even Claire seemed impressed. One evening, she stood at the back door, staring outside. "Okay." I looked up from my laptop. "Okay, what? This is actually amazing." I smiled. That's what happens when professionals get involved. She rolled her eyes immediately. Oh no, what? You've become unbearable. I'm an engineer. We call that being correct. The following week, the HOA began installing the permanent drainage solution on their own property. A real solution, not a shortcut, not a guess. Actual engineering, French drains, proper runoff controls, gravel filtration, collection systems, everything designed and reviewed correctly. Imagine that. One afternoon, I asked Travis how the new system compared to the original trench. He thought for a second. Well, I waited. The original trench definitely moved water. And now it moves water somewhere appropriate. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. But the moment I'll remember for the rest of my life happened near the end of the project. Late Thursday evening. The crew was finishing final adjustments. The weather was perfect. Warm air, fresh cut grass, sunlight fading behind the trees. Claire and I were sitting on the patio with drinks, just enjoying the view. For the first time in months, everything felt normal again. Then I noticed someone standing near the community walking path beyond the common area. About 50 yards away, partially hidden near a group of shrubs, there was Karen. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't supervising, wasn't giving instructions, just standing there, watching, and honestly, she looked completely different, not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone, the certainty was gone. The authority she'd worn like armor for years seemed to have disappeared overnight. You ever see someone after reality finally catches them? That exact moment when they realize confidence isn't the same thing as competence. That's what I saw. Karen stood there watching workers repair every mistake she'd created, watching thousands of dollars leave HOA reserves, watching evidence become consequences. Claire noticed her too. Without turning her head, she quietly lifted her glass. To community improvements, I almost choked. Karen stared for another few moments, then she turned around and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her in person. The final cost ended up landing somewhere around $18,000. Between legal fees, surveys, engineering reviews, landscaping, drainage improvements, tree replacement, and restoration work. It added up fast, but honestly, the money wasn't the biggest consequence, not even close. The real damage happened afterward, because neighborhoods run on reputation. And once trust disappears, everything changes. Word spread quickly. At first through conversations between neighbors, then through board meetings, then through community emails. People started asking questions. A lot of questions. Questions Karen had never been forced to answer before. Residents began bringing up old disputes, fence issues, architectural denials, warning notices, parking citations. Years of complaints suddenly looked different through a new lens. Once people discovered she had approved a project without verifying something as basic as a property line, they started wondering what else she had approved without doing proper homework. One evening I was checking the mailbox when my neighbor Daniel walked over holding a beer. He leaned against the curb. So, I already knew where this was going. I heard you basically went to war with the HOA. I laughed. That's a little dramatic, is it? Honestly, it was mostly a disagreement about where my backyard ended. Daniel looked toward my house. Seems like you won. That statement stayed with me, because the truth is, I never really felt like I won. Not the way people imagine winning. I didn't wake up feeling triumphant. I didn't celebrate. I didn't frame the settlement agreement and hang it on a wall. What I felt was relief. For months there had been this pressure sitting inside my chest. Every ignored email, every dismissive response, every storm that made me wonder how much additional damage I'd find afterward. Every moment someone in authority treated legitimate concerns like an inconvenience. That kind of thing changes how you see people. You start realizing how dangerous small amounts of power can become when nobody questions them. About 6 weeks after the project finished, the HOA distributed a community newsletter. Halfway through the email was a short announcement. Karen Holloway would be stepping down as HOA president due to personal commitments. Claire was reading the newsletter aloud in the kitchen. When she reached that sentence, she stopped, looked at me, then burst out laughing. What? Personal commitments? She shook her head. What an incredible coincidence. The new board moved quickly. Professional property management was hired. Construction oversight policies changed. Property surveys became mandatory before future projects. Communication standards improved. Basically, every reform homeowners had requested for years suddenly became common sense. Funny how that works. And today, honestly, life is pretty normal. The backyard looks better than ever. The drainage system works perfectly. Whenever heavy storms pass through, water disappears exactly where it's supposed to. No flooding, no standing water, no surprises. Sometimes, after a big rainstorm, I'll still glance out the kitchen window expecting to see muddy water gathering near the patio. Old habits die hard, but there's never anything there, just grass. A few months ago, we hosted a barbecue for friends and neighbors. At one point, someone looked around the yard and asked how things finally ended with the HOA. I remember standing there holding a plate of barbecue, looking across the lawn for a moment before answering. I think everybody eventually learned where the property line was, and maybe that's really what this story is about. Boundaries. Not just property boundaries. Personal boundaries. Professional boundaries. The boundaries that keep authority from becoming arrogance. Because if Karen had simply treated me like a human being from the beginning, none of this probably happens. One honest conversation, one site visit, one apology. That's all it would have taken. Instead, years of unchecked authority convinced her she didn't need to verify facts anymore. She assumed she was right, and assumptions are expensive when reality shows up carrying documentation. Now, here's what I'd genuinely love to know from you guys. Was I justified in pushing this as far as I did? Should I have accepted repairs and moved on, or was holding the HOA accountable the right thing to do? And have you ever dealt with a neighbor, manager, board member, or authority figure who acted untouchable until facts finally caught up with them? Drop your story in the comments because those conversations are always fascinating, and honestly, people tend to split right down the middle on situations like this. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around for more real-life stories where ordinary people discover that patience, documentation, and a little persistence can be a lot more powerful than authority ever expected.